Welcome to All 32. My name is Arabia, and here we talk all things football. I'm back in my studio, as you can see, so happy to be here after being away from home for about 2 weeks. The first stint was for about a week in the Bay Area to cover the Super Bowl, and then I came back home for a few days, and then went to LA for the Beats by Dre event. So thank you again to Beats by Dre for inviting me, and then a few NBA activations. So happy to be back here, happy to be back home, happy to be back in a familiar surrounding with a familiar background for you guys for now, because next week I'll be in Indianapolis. All 32 is bringing you boots on the ground coverage of the 2026 NFL Scouting Combine. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Today's episode, we're talking about the Combine and the draft since the Combine is coming up next week. We have a lot to go over, and I want to make sure that you guys are informed. Especially this off season, All 32 is a place to make sure that you are still up to date with all things football. Really, there's some people who, once the Super Bowl is over, or really once their team stops playing, they kind of fall off and don't watch football anymore, and that's completely fine. Most fans are casual fans, and I love that. People are busy; they have lives outside of just sports, so a lot of people don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to pay attention to football 365. So hopefully this is just a quick shot for you to tune into, see what's happening around the NFL, so that when the NFL season does roll back around, you already know what's going on because you've been tuned in to All 32 all offseason. So today's episode will be about the Combine and the draft, since they go hand in hand. One really rolls into the other. NFL Combines on-field drills happen in 4 days. Day 1 this year is Thursday, February 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Day 1 is for defensive linemen and DBs. Day 2 is Friday, February 27th at 3 p.m. That's for DBs and tight ends. Quarterbacks, wide receivers, and running backs go Saturday, February 28th at 1 p.m. And Sunday, March 1st at 1 p.m. are for my favorite position group, offensive linemen. So the strengths of this draft are really along the defensive line, particularly the edge rushers. It's also a great draft for wide receivers and a really deep class for linebackers and cornerbacks. So let's go over some of the top edge rushers projected to go relatively early in the draft this year. 3 names to keep an eye out for, not just in the draft, but in the Combine next week on day 1, since day 1 is for the defensive linemen. Arvell Reese out of Ohio State. Number 2 is David Bailey out of Texas Tech. And number 3 is Rueben Bain Jr. out of Miami. Of the 3 I just named, Arvell Reese is definitely the most versatile. In addition to being utilized as an edge rusher, he also lined up off the ball as a linebacker and was occasionally used as a quarterback spy. Pros for him are that he's fluid and aggressive. Cons are that he's late getting off the ball sometimes, and he doesn't always have a polished rush plan. Next is David Bailey out of Texas Tech. So if Arvell Reese is the more versatile option, David Bailey is the safer option. Watching his film week after week, you know exactly what you're going to get from David Bailey, and that helps you better determine how that might translate at an NFL level. So some of his strengths are his get off and his ability to win early in the down. Some of his areas of improvement are his speed to power and his physicality at the point of attack, but do not be surprised if you see David Bailey be the first edge rusher off the board in April. Last but certainly not least is Rueben Bain Jr. out of Miami, who was just extremely dominant and extremely disruptive at the line. He's a more polished rusher than David Bailey, but he doesn't have as great of a get off. He has great moves and he's absolutely relentless against the run. Some of his cons are his speed and his length, but he's been categorized as an identity pick, meaning he plays so hard, he plays so physical that he more than overcomes whatever weakness you might perceive on paper. Now let's talk about quarterbacks, because I've mentioned how this is a particularly strong draft for edge rushers, for wide receivers, for linebackers, for cornerbacks. Defensively, you've got some really key pieces in this draft, but I didn't mention anything about quarterbacks. First, let me say and acknowledge that scouting and this draft and combine process is not an exact science. There are 5th-round players who end up being superstars, undrafted free agents who end up being superstars, whether it's for a season or two. And there are 1st-round picks who end up really struggling and kind of falling off the map. So with that being said, this quarterback class in the draft this year isn't projected to be that great. So because the Raiders are number 1 off the board, and they are definitely in the market for a quarterback, Fernando Mendoza is projected to go number 1. Now, don't be surprised if Fernando Mendoza is the only quarterback to go in the 1st round. If there were to be another quarterback to go after that, I think it would be Ty Simpson. Ty Simpson right now is projected to go anywhere from 30 to 40. So that's like late 1st round, early 2nd round. Is there a scenario where a team can trade up to get Ty Simpson? Sure. Do I think that'll happen? No, because next year's quarterback class, the 2027 NFL draft, promises to have better quarterbacks. So I think we'll see scenarios where teams who need a quarterback will probably patch it over or use a veteran as a band-aid or as a bridge to get them to next year's draft, and to see, what kind of draft capital they can use to get higher picks, either in this draft, kind of like trading them as they go in April, or doing it during the season in trades or whatever in the offseason. So with that being said, Fernando Mendoza and Ty Simpson should be potentially the first 2 quarterbacks off the board. If they both go in the 1st, cool, but don't be surprised if one goes number 1 to the Raiders and the other one doesn't get picked up until sometime early in the 2nd round. Depending on how the combine goes, Ty Simpson's stock may actually rise. So that's a scenario where a team sees him, they like him, they're desperate for a quarterback, they really don't see light at the end of the tunnel for getting a veteran in the offseason or having anyone in free agency available to get. So there is a scenario if Ty Simpson just is lights out in the combine where his stock rises and he ends up going somewhere in the middle, late 1st round because the team needs him. But again, I really don't anticipate that. Daniel Jeremiah, who was the NFL Network's lead draft analyst, was asked if Mendoza were hypothetically ranked in last year's draft or the year before that's draft, where would he go? Like, would he go ahead of Cam Ward? Would he go after Cam Ward? If it was a draft before that, where would he rank as far as Bo Nix and Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels and Drake May, just that whole class? So he didn't directly answer the question. But what he said is that in the past, he gave Fernando Mendoza the same grade he gave Cam Ward. He said Cam Ward is way better off schedule. He's more fluid and smooth, but Mendoza protects the ball very, very well. Both have big arms, both excel in RPO, but Fernando Mendoza's best attribute is his toughness and poise, his mental and physical toughness. So in a way, it sounds like sort of pandering if you kind of read between the lines. But I think ultimately, since you don't exactly know how a quarterback might translate to the NFL, you do have some intangibles that you can draw conclusions from by looking at some of the best quarterbacks in the league. And some of the best quarterbacks in the league are mentally and physically tough. So take that for what you might. Hopefully the Raiders solve their quarterback problems that they've been having for a long time with Fernando Mendoza. In addition to the 3 edge rushers that we talked about, other names to look out for day one in the combine, which again is defensive linemen and DBs, are Sonny Styles, linebacker out of Ohio State, TJ Parker, edge out of Clemson, Keldrick Falk out of Auburn, Akeem Mesidor, edge out of Miami, Lee Hunter, defensive tackle out of Texas Tech, CJ Allen, linebacker out of Georgia, and Zion Young, edge out of Missouri. Like I said, all 32 will be boots on the ground in Indianapolis, bringing you coverage from the combine. I'll definitely talk a lot more before day one about the defensive line and DBs, and of course the position groups as we move forward. Let's talk about the AFC North and what each team may address in the draft and give you some names and positions to look out for, starting with the Steelers, who actually may put more stock into free agency and trades than in the draft this year. And by that, I mean they may use a 3rd round pick to go get a veteran in the offseason. They also might use this year's draft picks to accumulate more draft picks next year, which again promises to be more fruitful as far as quarterbacks are concerned. Historically, Pittsburgh likes to get their receivers in day 2, but this year you might see an exception to that. They may end up going receiver or cornerback and really addressing that perimeter. If they do stay with the 21st overall pick, and if they do go with a receiver, one name to look out for is Denzel Boston out of Washington. Another name to look out for is KC Concepcion out of Texas A&M. There are some projections, some mock drafts that have Jeremiah Love going to Pittsburgh at 21. I personally don't see that happening. I don't see Jeremiah Love lasting to 21, but it's entirely possible. It seems like a lot of the teams that may be in the market for a quarterback also are in the market for an offensive lineman or for an edge rusher. So it's entirely possible that Jeremiah Love might fall to 21 and Pittsburgh could pick him up. But again, I don't see the Steelers going with Jeremiah Love in this instance. Although if he's there, they might just go best available. There are also other projections that have the Steelers going defensive tackle in the 1st round. When I think about the Steelers season and the problems that they had, my mind doesn't immediately go defensive tackle. So that really wouldn't make much sense to me. Now for Baltimore, most mock drafts have the Ravens going receiver, edge rusher, or offensive lineman with that 14th overall pick. Today, since we're going over defensive linemen, let's talk about some edge rushers that Baltimore may have their eye on just in case they go that way. Not saying that Baltimore will pick an edge rusher with that 1st round pick, but just in case they do, you may see some names like Akeem Mesidor. You may also see them trade back for Mason Thomas out of Oklahoma. Both are very physical, very violent players that historically Baltimore loves to keep on the roster. Jesse Minter is in his 1st year at head coach with Baltimore, but he has a long history with the program, so he's probably familiar with the fact that they like that prototype at edge rusher. They could also try to get Cassius Howell out of Texas A&M, but again, most mock drafts have the Ravens getting a receiver to complement Zay Flowers. Receivers like Jordan Tyson out of Arizona State, also Carnell Tate out of Ohio State if he's still available. Tyler Linderbaum is set to hit free agency this offseason. Ravens GM Eric DeCosta said he's trying really hard to keep him on the roster and to work something out, but one way or another, Tyler Linderbaum will most likely become the highest paid center in the NFL, taking that number 1 spot away from Creed Humphrey, who right now makes $18 million a year. So the Ravens are absolutely going to have their eye out on the combine to see what's coming out of the draft, just in case they have to replace Tyler Linderbaum. Heavy defensive season for Cincinnati. I think we all know that. So let's go the less obvious route with their 41st pick, since the first few should be used on the defense. And let's talk about Omar Cooper Jr. out of Indiana. The Bengals offense operated best last year when they had a reliable slot receiver with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. So the more interesting aspect for Cincy is what they may do in these mid rounds. We talk a lot about 1st round picks, but we don't spend much time talking about these mid to late round picks. And there's a lot of gold there. Again, the Bengals' problems were not offensive outside of injuries, which you can't always predict. But there's a real possibility we could see them grab Omar Cooper Jr. and have one of the best wide receiver trios in the NFL. Last is Cleveland, who needs to address their offensive line. Do they invest in the draft or do they invest in free agency?